I live in what is considered a rural Australian area, but it's not really. Most of my neighbors only live a few hundred feet away, and their houses are easily in sight, but not within hearing range. My street is one of the few within my town with houses so far away. The rest of the streets are what you would consider typical suburban streets with houses normal distances apart. This happened to me when I was 14, back in 2010, and to this day still haunts me as it was never resolved. I was walking my best friend Jill home, and we were pretty exhausted as we had been prepping our horses for a show the next day. Jill Street is one of the normal streets within my town, yet the beginning of it is bordered by a pretty steep hill with Australian bush, and the other a thick scrubby ditch full of bush. Not necessarily intimidating, but definitely not the funnest part of the street to walk at dark as a 14-year-old girl. We had just passed this part of the street, and houses were on either side of us when an old red sedan pulled up. It was a little bit disconcerting, but nothing out of the usual, as a lot of cars did park on the street. However, as we walked a little bit further up the street, my friend Jill told me that the man in the red car was just standing there watching us. Alarm bells began to ring in my head, and I figured I should just turn around and go home so I wouldn't have to walk through the scary part of the street at dusk with a creepy man just standing there. I turned around and walked past the man on the other side of the street, figuring I was near houses and could easily run into one if trouble arose. Once I cleared that part of Jill's street, I was on my own road. I had a primary school on my right-hand side, closed for the night with no one there, and houses on my left. Yet those houses were still quite far away from me. At this point, it had gotten pretty dark, and I was walking quite fast as I knew something was up. I didn't run because I thought in my head it would trigger the creeper to react. It was at this point that I turned around and looked back towards the creepy part of Jill's street. The red car was slowly inching around, following me. I was still about several hundred feet from an entrance to my property, which is just a little gap in the fence one person can fit through. At this point, I began to run. The car sped up as I continued to run down my property to my house and watched this man drive about halfway down my driveway. No one was inside my house, and I frantically tried to find my parents. I ran around the back of the property to find my dad on the ride-on and flag him down and tell him I got followed home. My father drove out the front to see the man pulling out of our driveway, and he got in his car as quickly as he could to follow him and get his license plate. Unfortunately, my dad couldn't catch him, as my street is one of many streets in the area. I did end up reporting this to the police, and several other attempted abductions did occur in this area, yet none were successful. 2 years later, about several miles north of where I live, a girl was abducted and murdered, with a suspicious red car involved and a man fitting the description of the same one that followed me. This man is still at large, but thank goodness that my family and I have recently moved. So just a little bit of background information. I am a male and currently 25 and still living within 15 miles of my old house. This happened when I was about 8 or 9, making my sister at the time about 5 or 6 years old. We lived in a quiet neighborhood that, once I grew up, I found out was actually a lower income part of town. However, we had some wonderful neighbors, and it was thanks to these neighbors that a lot of potentially negative situations were avoided. At the time, my dad was working an 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. job, and my mother was a secretary at a hospital, which meant that during the day she was often at work. Usually my sister and I had a babysitter, but once I reached about 8 or 9, I began to be old enough to look out for us without a babysitter. Now this did happen in the 90s, which certainly were not safe, but were much safer than they are now. Also, we had the previously mentioned neighbors who generally did a good job of keeping an eye on us and our house. This particular incident was one of the first times I was charged to babysit my sister. She was in her high chair eating whatever my mom had left for us when I got a knock on our front door. Now this was strange since we never got visitors on a regular basis, other than the boy across the street who would want us to come out and play, but he usually just yelled my name while knocking. I was young and naive and decided to open the door. Now our front door had the main door, but there was also a locked screen door beyond that, which I left closed and locked. Outside was a middle-aged man. I hardly remember his facial features or even body type. I remember his yellow shirt and dirty jeans. I innocently asked him if I could help him. He only responded with a question and asked if my parents were home. My first alarm bell went off. My parents teaching me not to trust strangers rushed through my head, but I still didn't quite fully grasp the potential danger here. I told the man that my mother had went to the store and that she'll be back any moment. This was a weird half lie. I could have told him that she was home, but that she was showering, or that she was laying down upstairs. I'm so glad I didn't tell him that she wouldn't be back for quite a few hours. But looking back, it's scary how naive I was. The man replied and said it wasn't a problem. But then he told me that his dog went missing and that he believed it went into our backyard. So he then asked me if he could come in and we could check it out. Even though I may have been a young naive 8-year-old, there was no way in hell I was going to let this stranger into my house, especially with my sister there. Surely, I didn't want to have any harm fall on me, but she was my sister and it was my job to keep her safe. I should have closed the door right then and there, but once again I went with a less safe but still not totally stupid route. I then told the man that the backyard gate was unlocked and if he wanted he could go check the backyard. I then promptly closed the door. Now, of course, I was a young child, so I was very curious if there was a stray dog in my backyard. Even with the weird guy being around, I was pretty interested to see how his search in the backyard went, so I decided to go check the back window and see if there was actually a dog, and if so, if the man would catch it. When I looked out the back window, I could see almost the entire yard, including the gate. The man wasn't there. This was mere seconds after I had closed the door on him. I waited for a few minutes, but he never showed up. After about 5 minutes, there was another knock on my door. This time, I was much more wary and I didn't like this guy showing up. I was pretty tired of the whole ordeal, but I still hadn't fully grasped the situation. I kept the chain lock on the door and cracked it open. I asked him if he found his dog. Again, I can't remember his facial features, so I really cannot recall his expression. But I remember his tone was a bit desperate as well as annoyed. He told me no, that he did not find his dog, but he did tell me that he had a picture in his car if I wanted to come take a look just in case I saw him. At this point I had enough. I still didn't understand abduction, but I certainly was not going to go anywhere outside of the house with this stranger. I told him that he could leave a picture in the mailbox and we will keep an eye out. Once again, promptly closing the door. What followed is what really creeps me out to this day. Looking back, I was freaked out that I had come that close to exposing my sister and myself to danger, but this scared the hell out of me. Suddenly, there was more knocking on my door. Not the screen door separating the door, but the main door itself. Like I mentioned previously, the screen door was locked, and unless that was open, it was impossible to knock on the door itself. I later discovered that it turns out he had ripped a corner of the screen door and had unlocked the screen door that way. My dad had just assumed that it was wear and tear or us kids being kids. This really freaked me out, and I took my sister to my bedroom and crept back out to the kitchen where I could see out onto the front yard, and saw the man quickly getting back into his car while my saint of a next door neighbor, Mary, stood on her front lawn smoking and watching him intently. It took me a long time for me to add it all up and honestly, I had forgotten about it for a long time. When I finally remembered it all, I couldn't even believe my own memories. I am still debating with myself to actually tell my parents now. I wouldn't want to unnecessarily upset them. But maybe it's an important story to tell to my two younger sisters, one of whom is getting married soon, just as a life lesson.